Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Glad you're listening to this edition of Michael Brown Unplugged. Let's get started right away. I want to talk about the anti-Semitic cartoon that appeared in the op-ed section of the New York Times International Edition last Thursday. It depicted the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as a dachshund, as a wiener dog. He was wearing a Star of David collar, and he was leading a blind President Trump who was wearing a Jewish skull cap. Now, the New York Times received a lot of criticism for the publication of this clearly anti-Semitic cartoon. And then they issued a non-apology on Saturday that weaselly claimed that it was a cartoon that included anti-Semitic tropes. Rather than a forthright description, it was an anti-Semitic cartoon. Here's what the New York Times tweeted out. An editor's note to appear in Monday's International Edition. Yesterday. A political cartoon in the International Print Edition of the New York Times on Thursday included anti-Semitic tropes depicting the Prime Minister of Israel as a guide dog with a Star of David collar leading the President of the United States shown wearing a skull cap. The image was offensive, and it was an error of judgment to publish it. It was provided by the New York Times News Service and Syndicate, which has since deleted it. Now, knowing that this error of judgment didn't happen in a vacuum, this can really be seen as nothing but just another effort at normalizing anti-Semitism in the pages of the New York Times. So when they claim that it was an error in judgment to publish it, that's really laughable. It's really a quasi-apology. It's not, well, I'm not even sure it's a quasi-apology. I think it's a rationalization, plus not only is it a rationalization, I think when they tweeted out that it was an error of judgment to publish it, but it was provided by the New York Times News Service, because remember, this was published in the New York Times International Edition. What they're really trying to do is say, well, this was provided to us by the New York Times service out of New York, and, well, since they provided it, we just printed it. You know, like nobody looked at it. Now, when I say nobody looked at it, given that at least one editor of the International Edition had to approve publication of the cartoon, I think we can presume that that editor is somewhat educated and has some real awareness of the skyrocketing levels of anti-Semitism, both here in the United States and even worse, all across Europe. And I think that editor must be familiar with the blowback the paper receives every time that they engage in anti-Semitism. And the sad part is the New York Times regularly engages in anti-Semitism. So I don't think that such an error in judgment would appear to be an intentional decision. I don't want to think that it's an intentional decision. But interestingly, not one employee name is mentioned. There's no mention of whether those who made this so-called error in judgment will lose their jobs as a result of actively pushing anti-Semitism in a paper like the paper of record, the New York Times. The op-ed editor of the Jerusalem Post, Seth Franzman, makes it simple enough for even the editors of the New York Times to grasp. Seth Franzman tweeted out this: the New York anti-Semitic cartoon, numerous clear anti-Semitic elements. 1, putting a skull cap on the U.S. president in a negative way. 2, putting the face of the prime minister of the Jewish state on a dog. 3, using a Star of David on the collar. And 4, implying that the United States is blindly led by Jews and or Israel. Now, I think it's kind of worth our time to remember what the executive editor, Dean Baquet, told the public editor of the New York Times back in 2015 about his decision not to run the Charlie Hebdo cartoon in the pages of the New York Times. Now, just as a reminder, the Charlie Hebdo cartoon is that cartoon published by this magazine in France that publishes a lot of, I would just describe it as anti-radical Islamic cartoons and articles. And of course, the publication of that cartoon resulted in the killing of those people at the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris, and then of course led to even more terrorist attacks throughout Europe. But anyway, back to the executive editor, Dean Baquet. Here's what he told the editors back in 2015 about his decision not to run the same cartoons that got the editors of the Charlie Hebdo magazine killed, because other magazines and other newspapers throughout the world ran those cartoons that said, in essence, "We are Charlie Hebdo." Quote, Mr. Baquet told me that he started out the day Wednesday convinced that the Times should publish those images, both because of their newsworthiness and out of a sense of solidarity with the slain journalists and the right of free expression. He said he had spent about half of my day on the question, seeking out the views of senior editors and reaching out to reporters and editors in some of the Times international bureaus. They told him they would not feel endangered if the Times did reproduce the images, but he still remained concerned about staff safety. Really? He goes on to say, I sought out a lot of views and I changed my mind twice. It had to be my decision alone. Ultimately, he decided against it, he said, because, now listen closely, here's why. The editor of the New York Times, the executive editor, said about his decision not to join other newspapers and magazines around the world that published the same cartoon and said, "We are all Charlie Hebdo." He had to consider foremost the sensibilities of Times readers, especially its Muslim readers. To many of them, he said, depictions of the Prophet Muhammad are sacrilegious. Those that are meant to mock, even more so. We have a standard that is long held and that serves us well, that there is a line between gratuitous insult and satire. Most of these, the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, are gratuitous insult. Well, hang on. Clearly, the sensibilities of Jewish readers were not considered in the decision-making process to publish this anti-Semitic cartoon over the weekend. But then again, even the New York Times understands that the only real risk in offending the Jewish community is a short-lived collective outcry and the possible cancellation of subscriptions, impacts they have previously absorbed, and quite frankly, I don't think they give a rat's ass about. This morning, however, or actually technically yesterday morning, an actual apology was published. But of course, it makes me wonder why such a direct "we owe it" apology wasn't made right out of the gate. Why wasn't it made in the first place? It took 4 days after the fact. That actually diminishes its intended impact. In a sad bit of irony, the apology comes as the following. New York Times tweets, "We apologize for the anti-Semitic cartoon we published. Here's our statement. We are deeply sorry for the publication of an anti-Semitic political cartoon last Thursday in the print edition of the New York Times that circulates outside of the United States, and we are committed to making sure nothing like this happens again. Such imagery is always dangerous, and at a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise worldwide, it's all the more unacceptable. We have investigated how this happened and learned that, because of a faulty process, a single editor working without adequate oversight downloaded the syndicated cartoon and made the decision to include it on the opinion page. The matter remains under review, and we are evaluating our internal process and training. We anticipate significant changes. This faulty process they refer to, it's nothing new, not even in the New York headquarters of the Times. New York Times columnist Brett Stevens addressed the publication of the cartoon when he pointed out, the Times was not explaining anti-Semitism, it was purveying it. He writes, here was an image that, in another age, might have been published in the pages of Der Stürmer, the Jew in the form of a dog, the small but wily Jew leading the dumb and trusting American, the hatred Trump being Judaized with a skull cap, the nominal servant acting as the true master. The cartoon checked so many anti-Semitic boxes that the only thing missing was a $. The image also had an obvious political message, namely that in the current administration, the United States follows wherever Israel wants to go. This is false. Consider Israel's horrified reaction to Trump's announcement last year that he intended to withdraw U.S. forces from Syria. But that's beside the point. There are legitimate ways to criticize Trump's approach to Israel, in pictures as well as words, but there was nothing legitimate about this cartoon. Now, while Bret Stephens questions its placement in the New York Times, he cuts the publication and the editor some slack and is actually willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, something that I'm not willing to do. I don't want to read everything that he wrote, but just take this as an example. He says, for sometimes readers, or as often former readers, the answer is clear. The Times has a long-standing Jewish problem, dating back to World War II, when it mostly buried news about the Holocaust and continuing into the present day in the form of intensely adversarial coverage of Israel. The criticism goes double when it comes to the editorial pages, whose overall approach toward the Jewish state tends to range, with some notable exceptions, from tut-tutting disappointment to thunderous condemnation. The problem with the cartoon he wrote isn't that its publication was a willful act of anti-Semitism. It wasn't. The problem is that its publication was an astonishing act of ignorance of anti-Semitism, and that at a publication that is otherwise hyper-alert to nearly every conceivable expression of prejudice, from mansplaining to racial microaggressions to transphobia. You know, Bret Stephens is exactly right. He really does rip them apart. You know, it's going to be interesting to see if the editor is actually fired, if any editor is actually fired over this error in judgment. And frankly, it'd be interesting to learn exactly what an investigation reveals. But here's the bottom line. Will anything ever really change at the New York Times? After all, the publication of the cartoon occurred during Jewish Holy Week. Think about that. There's a whole bunch of background about why this cartoon was published. But I think what we have to learn, what you and I have to understand, is the New York Times does have an incredibly horrific anti-Semitic bent. I don't care whether people get fired. In fact, you've heard me say before that I don't like it when people say stupid things or even racially insensitive or even bigoted things. Now, I get that private organizations have the right to fire anybody for any reason or no reason. They can fire people for saying racially insensitive or bigoted things or choose not to do so. I just don't, and I'm not one of these that jumps on the bandwagon that thinks that every, misstep and every misstatement of something or anything that's even bigoted deserves a person getting fired. I would rather those people stay in place, and instead that we learn to recognize that organizations like the New York Times have a systemic anti-Semitism problem. And then let the chips fall where they may. Or rather, let the cancellations occur when they should. Changing tunes just a little bit. Well, changing tunes quite a bit. I ran across this article. I'm always amazed at, I love home remedies. Not that I use them. I just like to read about home remedies. I like to read about things that tell me you can cure cancer and you can cure almost any disease or malady that you might have with this particular home cure. Have you ever looked at websites? You're scrolling through a website. Some are worse than others. Some are so bad with advertisements that it's actually difficult to read the story that they've posted, because over here in the corner are pictures about Hollywood starlets and here's how ugly they look without their makeup. Or here's a home remedy. Or my favorite one is this. Here's what doctors don't tell you about X, whatever X is. And I admit, occasionally, I'll click them on because I'm kind of curious. I've got kind of a morbid curiosity about what exactly is it that Dr. X isn't, or some doctor doesn't want us to know the truth about, or that the medical industry is hiding from us. And I guess I haven't learned that it's always a trick, because to find out what the real secret is, you have to give them your email address. Now, I have learned I've got a fake email address that I will use to do that, just so I can go read what, it's purely entertainment on my part. but I didn't realize that there was this home remedy. Men, this isn't for you. Women, pay attention. Apparently, there's a nasty rumor that's been around for years, I'm totally unaware of it, that women in need of a yeast infection cure should look no further than the produce aisle at your grocery store. So the myth states that the simple act of inserting a garlic clove into your vagina will help to remedy the entirely unpleasant sensation that anyone in possession of a vagina has at some point experienced. I don't know. I don't have one. I've never experienced a yeast infection, but apparently it's quite uncomfortable. I wasn't aware that the way to solve that was not to go to your doctor and get some sort of antibiotic or, antiviral or whatever it might take to, I know nothing about yeast infections. Little did I know it was just a clove of garlic. You just insert the garlic. Well, according to this story, it turns out that this do-it-yourself method is actually not an effective treatment for that internal burning or itching. In fact, it can actually harm your genitals. And that's why Dr. Jen Gunter, an OBGYN doctor and the author of The Vagina Bible, wrote a now viral thread of tweets to end the cycle of fake vagina news. You see, we have all kinds of fake news. Fake vagina news, I swear. At least twice a month, she tells us, her patients inform her that they've attempted to self-medicate with garlic. She says the legend is so pervasive because it's a long-standing tale that's now being further spread by resources like Our Bodies Ourselves, which, quote, people consider legitimate and automatically believe. Stop. Just stop the presses. Stop the podcast for a second and let me go off on a tangent. This is why the internet's going to be the destruction of civilization as we know it. People actually believe everything they read on the internet. Why is that? Why is it that just like I get this entertainment value of clicking on an advertisement over on the side somewhere about something a doctor doesn't want you to know, or this is what the medical community does not want you to know. Why do I click on that? I don't click on it because I really think I'm going to learn something. I click on it for purely entertainment purposes. But apparently a lot of people click on it and think that they're going to find out something. This doctor says that about 50 to 70% of women who think they have a yeast infection actually have something else, so you don't know what you could be treating. To the naysayers who claims it's worked for them, Dr. Gunter tries to respond to them directly on Twitter. Medical advice on Twitter. You see, Your Honor, I rest my case. The internet will be the end of civilization as we know it. She tweets, or she writes, there's a powerful placebo effect, and these women might not have had a yeast infection which can go away on its own regardless in the first place. Dr. Gunter explains that she just hopes to stop the cycle of misinformation. Doctor, we all want to do that. Whether it's do-it-yourself remedies for yeast infections or it's just fake news in general. Now, some people say that her tweets feel like an affront to anyone who went the homeopathic, or maybe we should say garlic route. She says, I try my best not to blame the woman who feels she was driven to it. Medicine drove her to that. Naturopaths drove her to that. My anger, she says, is that the things that made a woman feel that desperate led her to do that. I want to give them the education so they know topical antifungals, which you can get over the counter, are very safe and very effective. I don't know. I mean, are you offended by that story? Call somebody that cares. I just didn't realize that some women were reading on the internet that if you went to the grocery store and bought a clove of garlic and inserted it into your genitals, that somehow that would fix the yeast infection. Jiminy Christmas, you learn something every day, don't you? Netflix has a promo out about walruses. Now, I was not aware of this. I am the walrus, you are the walrus. Anybody get that reference? The promo goes like this.
I don't understand. Why are they going up there? Like, literally to the top of the rockiest part of the cliff.
Once at the top of the 80-metre cliffs, they rest until it's time to return to the sea in search of food.
That's the last little section, isn't it? The really steep bit, and they all just... It's really steep, that bit.
One's going to go, and there's one right on the edge.
Ooh, the dramatic music. Ooh, scary, scary, scary. Now you see the walruses gathering on the cliff, and...
There's probably 200 or 300 dead walrus on like a half-mile stretch of beach here. They're exhausted because they're having to swim 100 miles now to get to food, and then coming back here because it's the only place to sleep. They used to sleep on the ice, dive down, eat the food, sleep on the ice, easy. And now they're swimming 100 miles, coming to this place, climbing cliffs, and they're just exhausted and falling down and either being killed falling or just crushing each other because there's several thousand crammed onto little tiny bits of beaches.
It's a sad reality of climate change. They'd be on the ice right now if they could be, but there's no option but to come to land. And they're just a danger unto themselves. Really hard to watch and witness this. It's just so heartbreaking.
Of course, Netflix wants to tie the walruses jumping off a cliff like lemmings to climate change. I did a little bit of study, and apparently this is a phenomenon that occurs on a fairly regular cycle. And the walruses, regardless of how much ice is below, regardless of how much food is available, that it's almost a culling of the herd, and that these hordes of walruses will gather on the cliff, and then they will all, again like lemmings, just jump to their death. You know, nature's always been fascinating to me. And I always thought that actually seeing nature in the wild, these shows that show, you know, the animals killing each other and the food chain, how that food chain works, is great for people that never understand what nature is really like. But here's Netflix being politically correct and disingenuous. The walruses aren't doing this because of climate change. The walruses are doing this because this is something that is in their DNA and that they have been doing for centuries. They've always done this. I don't know, and I can't find a really good scientific, well, I can find some scientific explanations for why they do it. I'm just too stupid to understand exactly why. What I do understand is Netflix is being disingenuous, and it's not because of climate change. How do you go from walruses to Jussie Smollett? Just like this. Kim Foxx, who is the Cook County State's attorney, apparently is in a little trouble again. Now, just as a little background, you may or may not recall that Kim Foxx is the one that Michelle Obama's former chief of staff, when Jussie Smollett was arrested, I shouldn't say when he was arrested, but when this so-called hate crime initially occurred, Michelle Obama's chief of staff, former chief of staff, maybe she still works for her, I don't know, reached out to Cook County State Attorney Kim Foxx to make certain that nothing got swept under the rug and to make certain that whenever they found the bad guys that had committed this horrific hate crime against black gay actor Jussie Smollett, that they would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Then it comes to light that Cook County State Attorney Kim Foxx had been approached and had been talked to about prosecuting this case. So at the time, she did what I think she should have done. She recused herself from the case, meaning she thought that in order to avoid the appearance of impropriety, as lawyers should, she took herself out of the case. and said she would not be involved in it, and she turned it over to another prosecutor in another Cook County prosecution office, and they prosecuted the case. And, of course, we know what happened. She showed back up in court. After recusing herself, she walked into the courtroom, and she's the one that decided, yeah, we're going to dismiss the charges, and as restitution, we will take the $1,000 or $1,500 or $10,000, whatever it was, that you had put up as bail money, and that will suffice as restitution and for reimbursement for the hundreds of thousands of dollars that the city of Chicago and Cook County had spent investigating this fake hate crime, this hoax crime. Well, Kim Foxx has been subpoenaed over the Jussie Smollett case, while a judge has slammed her for a double standard. Cook County State Attorney Kim Foxx's woes continue as retired appellate judge Sheila O'Brien filed a petition for a special prosecutor to investigate Foxx's office over the Jussie Smollett case. Foxx received a subpoena to appear in court along with her top deputy, Joseph Maggots. Maggots, M-A-G-A-T-S, I don't know. Maggots, I don't know. This news comes after one Cook County judge slammed Foxx for her double standards after her office prosecuted one woman for filing a false report. Those are the same charges that Foxx's office dropped against Jussie Smollett. You see, I guess if you are an actor, a gay actor, a black actor, and Michelle Obama's former chief of staff is your friend, you get one form of justice. And if you're just a ordinary Joe, or in this case an ordinary Sally, who files a false police report, you get prosecuted. The other doesn't. Smollett faced 16 felony counts after the Chicago Police Department had determined that he staged the racist and homophobic attack on himself back in January. Now, I talked on the radio about how Foxx continued to communicate with her team on the Smollett case even after she had recused herself, which is probably a violation of the Code of Conduct for lawyers and prosecutors, but that's another story for another time. But there are texts with Maggots that showed how she called the 16 felony counts against Smollett excessive. In one text, she wrote, "So," and I mean so as in S-O-O-O. "So," she wrote, "I'm recused. But when people accuse us of overcharging cases, 16 counts on a Class 4 becomes Exhibit A." She texted that on March 8. Pedophile with 4 victims, 10 counts. Washed up celeb who lied to cops, 16 counts. On a case eligible for deferred prosecution, I think it's indicative of something we should be looking at generally, she wrote. Just because we can charge something doesn't mean we should. Then she referred to the case of R&B singer R. Kelly, who was indicted on 10 counts of aggravated criminal sexual abuse in connection with 4 women, 3 of whom were underage. But now, this Cook County judge wants a special prosecutor to investigate Foxx's office. From the Chicago Sun-Times, we get this. They write, Foxx's conflict in this matter is beyond dispute. Instead, Foxx misled the public into believing that Smollett's case was handled like any other prosecution and without influence. But emails and text messages turned over to the Chicago Sun-Times in response to a records request showed that weeks before Smollett was charged, and when the actor was considered by police to be a crime victim, Foxx had talked to Chicago lawyer Tina Shin, who put her in touch with a relative of Smollett's. Foxx also acknowledged urging Chicago Police Department Superintendent Eddie Johnson to turn the investigation over to the FBI. So this retired judge wants a judge outside of Cook County to, quote, decide her request for a special prosecutor. The Chicago Tribune is now reporting that Smollett's attorneys have objected to the petition since, quote, special prosecutors may be appointed only if cases are still pending. You see, they stated that O'Brien's petition would duplicate the efforts of the County Inspector General's office, which is conducting a review of the prosecution. Now, all of us knew, we all knew that there was something fishy about Fox's office dropping the charges against Smollett just out of thin air. But it turns out the double standard actually exists. Cook County Judge Mark Martin presided over an unrelated case when he took shots at Fox and her office for creating a situation where anyone charged with filing a false report would expect the same leniency her office afforded Smollett. It turns out they don't. So back to that woman I mentioned, Candace Clark. She's 21 years old. She faces one felony charge of making a false police report, the same charges Smollett faced. Chicago's Fox 32 channel. According to a transcript obtained by Fox 32, Judge Martin hammered prosecutors, asking, "I'd like to know why Ms. Clark is being treated differently than Jussie Smollett. It's a disorderly conduct case, a lot less egregious than Mr. Smollett's case, and I've got a problem with it." Oh, what an intricate weave of deceit we do when we start trying to impose different standards for different people. The statue of justice, the blind statue of justice, holding the scales of justice. Yeah, I think she's having problems. Fox 32 continued. Prosecutors were demanding that Clark make full restitution of $2,800 and serve deferred prosecution, something not required of Smollett. Said Judge Martin, "Ms. Clark is not a movie star. She doesn't have a high-priced lawyer, and this smells big time. Your office created this mess. There's no publicity on this case. Press gets a hold of this, it'll be the newspaper." Now, Fox already lost two important people in her office. Yeah, some people do still have standards. Ethics Office April Perry and Conviction Integrity Unit Director Mark Rotert both submitted their resignation letters last week. Why am I fascinated by this case? Because I truly do believe in equal justice under the law. And I truly do believe that in this case, because Jussie Smollett, and let me be abundantly clear about this, I don't care whether you're gay or straight. I don't care whether you're black or white. I don't care what your ethnicity or your race is. I don't care whether you're a Hollywood actor or you're not a Hollywood actor. I do know, however, that depending on how much money is in your bank account, you can either hire a really good lawyer, an okay lawyer, or you might end up with a public defender. But once you walk into that courtroom, I expect both the prosecutors and the judge to treat everybody exactly the same. And when you walk in, and because you are a black gay actor on a television show that virtually nobody watches, and you get special treatment because Michelle Obama's former chief of staff reaches out to the Cook County prosecutor's office, and she recuses herself and then unrecuses herself, I guess I could just say, well, that's Chicago. But as goes Chicago, goes the rest of the country. And the judges who are pointing out, particularly this judge that has a case in his courtroom where this one woman, Candace Clark, is facing one felony charge and they're having the book thrown at her while Jussie Smollett walks, that's wrong. And that's un-American. And I think the Jussie Smollett case proves. What does it prove? I'm trying to think of how to put this kindly. It proves that elected officials have got to be held to a higher standard. And the only way that we can do that is by a press. And I know some of you are starting to snicker already. But a fourth estate, a press, and maybe it is local media, Fox 32, the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times. Maybe they're actually doing the work that CNN and MSNBC and Fox and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Denver Post and whatever newspapers in your community, maybe they're setting an example of what real journalism is like. And what is that? Holding elected officials accountable, making sure that they're treating everybody the same. Touché for them. You know what those judges in Chicago are really doing? They're giving that prosecutor, Foxx, and Jussie Smollett the middle finger, which is a great segue into this story. Kid Rock buys a giant middle finger statue for his home in Nashville because he's Kid Rock. I'm looking at a photograph of this, and it shows it being pulled up by a crane, and there's a guy standing next to it. So best I can tell, I'm not sure whether this story describes exactly the size of it. Oh, yeah, here it is. No, it's being mounted on a 14-foot pole, but it doesn't show exactly how big the statue is. But when I look at the photograph, there's a man on a crane standing on the platform where the hand with the middle finger extended is resting, and the statue, or the giant middle finger, looks to be about 3 or 4 times the size of this guy standing on the crane. So if this guy is just, say, 6 foot tall, the hand plus the middle finger sticking out must be about 24 feet tall. And he's putting it on a pole that, what did I say? 14-foot tall pole on his property, installed lights so it's visible at night, a giant middle finger. The Detroit-born musician decided to revamp his home decor and surprise Nashville residents with a gigantic 700-pound middle finger statue. Why the middle finger statue? Well, Rock is pretty much known for it. It's even graced one of his CD covers. So, yeah, it's an instant habit for him, and what Kid Rock wants, Kid Rock gets. The statue, according to the story, roots back to November 2018, was created by Ted Pelkey, a small business owner from Westford, Vermont. The idea came to him after he was trying to find the best way to cut down his expenses while keeping his business alive. He decided he wanted to move from a shop he rents about 25 miles away. His idea was to build a new shop at his own property and work from there, but unfortunately, Westford told him no, so basically Pelkey responded the only way he could, by creating the bird statue. So not only did this genius artist build a gigantic 7-foot tall statue of a hand giving the middle finger, but he mounted it on a 14-foot tall pole in his property and installed lights on it so it's visible at night. I don't think that's a subtle message. I think that's a pretty loud message. So that's where Kid Rock and his middle finger obsession comes in. During Christmas, Pelkey said that Kid Rock had left him a message saying, "Hey, Ted, Merry Christmas. It's Bob Ritchie, Kid Rock." The Southern rock star then told Pelkey that he liked the statue and had to have a finger on his own property in Nashville. So the Vermont artist quickly began to work on a second middle finger and is now ready to be shipped all the way to Nashville. The second big bird is said to be delivered to Kid Rock next month, and I can already see all the pictures going viral. And I can already see homeowners, every homeowner that can see the middle finger from their back porch or their front porch is going to be filing complaint with the Nashville City Council and trying to shut down Kid Rock's middle finger. I love it. I should probably get one of those middle fingers. I can think of a few people I'd like to give them middle finger to. Maybe I can just get one mounted on the top of my car and drive it around. How about that? Where do we go next? Hang on. Every once in a while, I like to do a story that reminds all of us as Americans what a great country we live in. What a civilized country that we live in. We have, despite the problems we have with the Jussie Smollett case in Cook County, Illinois, or despite the problems we have with, some people that want to blow up synagogues, or that want to blow up mosques, or that want to mow down people that are on a pedestrian walkway somewhere. We've got our problems. But we know how to handle those problems in what, at least from my perception, is a civilized manner. I read a story recently about Saudi Arabia executing a bunch of people, including a whole bunch of people who had been caught, and I don't know how they were caught, but somehow were caught engaging in homosexual acts. Now, as I've said 1,000 times, I don't care what your sexual preference is, and in fact, I don't think it's any of my business. But the killing of gay people under Sharia law, under Islamic law, I just think is completely uncivilized. I don't care if, and if you are staunchly anti-gay, you have to at least admit that the killing of people for their sexual activity, I mean, outside some criminal activity like, child molestation or rape or some sort of sexual aggravated assault, anything, well, I shouldn't say anything, but I would say generally, sexual acts between consenting adults, I really think is none of the government's business. Apparently, that's not the case in Saudi Arabia, where they recently executed people for the simple act of being gay. But included in that story, just again to give you some perspective if you're frustrated about the American judicial system, there's this story.
Human rights groups are condemning Saudi Arabia's mass execution of 37 prisoners accused of terrorism and espionage. Amnesty International says 11 of the men put to death were convicted of spying for Iran after what it called a grossly unfair trial.
Now, I don't know whether the trials were fair or not. But in this country, once you've had a trial, a fair trial for treason, and if you're convicted of treason, you can be put to death for that. Of course, we also have an appeals process that would more than likely end up in the Supreme Court. And you would, if the court let the conviction stand, you very likely could be given the juice and you could be executed for treason. So I'm not going to criticize the Saudi government for, now again, I wasn't there. I don't know how fair the trials were, but if indeed these individuals were convicted of treason, of conspiracy to commit acts of terror, and the death penalty is the appropriate penalty, then okay. But listen closely.
Amnesty says at least 14 others were convicted for participating in anti-government protests.
Convicted of engaging in anti-government protests. All right. If you're convicted of while engaging in an anti-government protest and you violate some law about obstructing traffic, well, we would treat that as a misdemeanor, more than likely just a misdemeanor, not a felony, and you certainly wouldn't be executed for that. But I do have a problem with this whole idea of you criticize the government or you protest against the government, and that in and of itself is a crime. Yeah, I got a problem with that. Let's continue.
Between 2011 and 12. Amnesty says the 14 men were tortured in order to have, quote, confessions extracted from them. One prisoner's body and severed head were put on display in a public crucifixion. In response, Maya Foa, director of the British legal charity Reprieve, said, quote, that the Saudi regime believes it has impunity to carry out such patently illegal executions without notice should shock its international partners into action.
Well, but it's not going to shock us into action because it's their government and they can do what they want to do. I do think, however, that we ought to put some pressure on the Saudis to at least what? Well, let's be honest. We're not going to do it. I was going to say something stupid. Something stupid like we ought to put pressure on the Saudis to kind of revamp their judicial system. But that's not going to happen, and who am I kidding? Months after Judicial Watch reported that migrants from terrorist nations tried to enter the United States via Mexico at record rates, government figures show that more than 10,000 illegal aliens from countries that sponsor terrorism are currently living in the United States. I have said a bazillion times, okay, I've said at least 465,000 times, okay, I've said at least 35,000 times, that border security is national security. And here's proof. It's not clear how they entered the country, but federal authorities know about them because they have either been deported or they have final removal orders pending. But They are not in custody, and they are roaming freely in unsuspecting communities throughout the United States. These numbers were obtained from Immigration and Customs Enforcement by a public interest group that favors secure borders and exposes the harms of mass migration. This nonprofit conducted a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request, and made the figures public just this month. They show that 10,340 non-detained illegal immigrants from Iran, Syria, Sudan, and North Korea were on ICE's national docket as of June of last year. Iran, who constantly shouts death to America, tops the list with 6,331, followed by Syria, the home of ISIS, with 2,128, Sudan with 1,860, and, to my surprise, North Korea with 21. All four of those countries have been designated as state sponsors of terrorism by the State Department. So when somebody tells you that we should just have open borders, you ought to throw these stats out. Now, do we know what crimes, if any, these 10,000 plus people have committed? No, we have not. But the thing I would caution us to remember is this. Terrorists, unlike corporate America or you and me, have the patience, the unbelievable patience, to wait as much time as necessary to put together their plans, their spectacular plans, to do harm to this country. And excuse me, and if that means that they have to wait 6 months or 6 years, they'll wait 6 months or 6 years. They're not like us that looks just to the next quarter. They look long term. And so if there are 10,000 illegal aliens in this country from countries that we know are state sponsors of terrorism, from countries that we know want to destroy the United States of America, and you tell me that open borders is the humane thing to do, I'd say you're insane. You're absolutely insane. Border security indeed is national security. And until we get that through the heads of the yahoos in Congress that refuse to reform the immigration system, more and more will come. They'll continue to come in, and we won't know what to do with them or where to find them. Or when we do find them, we'll just tell them, hey, we realize you're from Iran and you're here illegally. Would you show up in court, say 6 months from now? Yeah, we'll trust you to do that. Good grief. Sometimes I truly believe we are suicidal as a nation. And so while most of the people on the left don't really want to talk about illegal immigration or the danger that it poses to national security, what they do want to talk about is climate change. I ran across a story recently that talked about, I forget whether this was, it came from Democracy Now!, but it talked about the amount of money that we need to spend in order to truly combat climate change. Now, as you probably know from listening to me in the past, I'm one of those guys that believes the climate changes, that it's been changing ever since the earth was formed, and it will continue to change. It changed before humans were on the planet, and it will continue to change after humans leave the planet. It's just the nature of nature. So this whole idea, this arrogant idea that somehow we can alter the climate and that we can alter climate by spending money is insane. But I just didn't realize how insane it was till I heard this story on Democracy Now!
In climate news, an alarming new report published in the journal Nature Communications finds without immediate action to curb greenhouse gas emissions, melting Arctic permafrost could add as much as $70 trillion to the overall economic impact of climate change.
$70 trillion. I know when you start talking about trillions, it's hard for me to comprehend. The gross domestic product of the United States in 2017 was about just slightly over $19 trillion. So 3 or 4 times the entire economic output of the United States is apparently what climate change is going to cost us if we don't take immediate action. And I guess if we don't take immediate action, we're all going to be like those walruses and we're all going to be jumping off a cliff. So one of my most ardent supporters and listeners sent me this little factoid today about windmills, which I found fascinating. A 2 megawatt windmill is made up of 260 tons of steel that required 300 tons of iron ore and 170 tons of coking coal, all mined, transported, and produced by hydrocarbons. A windmill could spin until it falls apart and never generate as much energy as was invested in building it. Every time you drive past one of those wind farms and you see those giant blades whirling, watch for the birds that get killed as the birds go flying through them. But I want you to remember this. That windmill could spin until it just fell apart from just wearing out, just old age, and it will never generate as much energy as the amount of energy that was used to build it. Doesn't mean I'm against wind energy any more than I'm against electric cars. Just don't tell me you're saving the earth. Just don't tell me that you are saving money or saving energy. A 2 megawatt windmill is made up of 260 tons of steel. Those 260 tons of steel required 300 tons of iron ore and 170 tons of coking coal, all which had to be mined, transported, and produced by hydrocarbons. So that one windmill could spin until it falls apart and never generate as much energy as was invested in building it. Oh, $70 trillion? Yeah. 3 or 4 times the gross domestic product of the United States. So speaking of which, I ran across this story, and I never heard this phrase before. Renewable portfolio standards. And this comes from the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. It's dated just this past week. Renewable portfolio standards, or RPS, are the largest and perhaps most popular climate policy in the United States. Renewable portfolio standards have been enacted by 29 states in the District of Columbia. Using the most comprehensive panel set of data ever compiled on program characteristics and key outcomes, we compare states that did and did not adopt these policies, exploiting the substantial differences in the timing of adoption. The estimates indicate that 7 years after passage of a renewable portfolio standard program, the required renewable share of generation is 1.8 percentage points higher, and average retail electricity prices are 1.3 cents per kilowatt, or 11% higher. Meaning that when you adopt these renewable portfolio standards, which say you've got to have so much renewable energy in your portfolio, the cost of electricity, which goes to power everything, goes up 11% higher. The comparable figures for 12 years after adoption are 4.2 percentage point increase in renewable share, meaning you adopt these standards and renewables only account for a 4% part of the entire portfolio of energy production. And even at that point, a price increase of 2 cents per kilowatt, or 17% higher. So every time you hear that we need to adopt, or like in Colorado, we have Xcel. I don't know what your energy company is, but Xcel wants to, they're always sending me stuff about, do you want to buy wind energy? Do you want to buy solar energy? You can pay more. Well, here's why. Because it costs more. The estimated reduction in carbon emissions is imprecise, but together with the price results, indicates that the cost per metric ton of CO2 abated, meaning how much CO2 did you actually reduce, exceeds $130 in all specifications and ranges up to $460, making it at least several times larger than conventional estimates of the social cost of carbon. So every time that somebody tells you we're going to increase the portfolio of renewables, you're actually increasing the cost not only of the power, but the cost of abating that CO2 is more expensive than even you recoup from the increased power costs. It's insane what we're doing in terms of energy. But speaking of energy, do you have one of those Nest thermostats in your home? You might want to think about this.
Before we let you go,
Yes.
Brett, the other story we mentioned before the break, the idea of hacking your home security system. There's a story in the Washington Post in the article titled How Nest, designed to keep intruders out, effectively allowed hackers to get in. These Nest cameras, vulnerable to hacking, it says, from something as simple as your email, your password. But can you explain this for us?
Yes. What happens in situations like this, people aren't changing the default settings and they're not adding a unique password to them. And then what happens is you have these credential stuffings. You go on the dark web. These hackers can go on the dark web. They can find all this information about you, which generally all they need is your email address and a password. And then they can hack into these home security devices. If you have any sort of device in your home that has a camera or a microphone in it, and it has the ability to monitor what you're doing, absolutely double and triple check what your security settings are. Give it a complicated password. And in this instance, write the password down and stick it to the bottom of the device if you're afraid you're going to forget it, because at least you'll be the only person who can see that password. And especially, like, the article in the paper was heartbreaking because this was in someone's child's room and people were harassing the kid at night. So especially if it's going to be watching over a small child.
That. Yeah, so it's your own, it's on you essentially.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Basically what the company said. All right, Brett, good to see you.
But you know what? Everybody relies on the fact that everybody's lazy and nobody's going to change the, what's the username? Admin. What's the password? 1234. Yeah, I don't need to change that. Nobody cares about me until they do, and they start spying on you. Here's the deal. I think I'll put one of these Nest cameras up here in my studio, and then you guys can hack into it, and you can be, although I'm not a kid, and you can harass me all you want to. Username, admin, password, 1234. Thanks for listening to this edition of Michael Brown Unplugged. I would ask you again, go to the website, michaelbrowntoday.com, michaelbrowntoday.com, and you'll see over there in the corner, you'll see the Spreaker box where you can download the podcast. You can stream and listen to the podcast live. We're also up on Spotify. We should be up on iTunes pretty soon, but right now we're on Spreaker and we're on Spotify. You'll see across the bottom at michaelbrowntoday.com. You'll see all the social media sites. So if you want to follow me on Instagram, you want to follow me on Twitter or Facebook, I would really appreciate it if you would do that. I appreciate you liking these podcasts. I appreciate you streaming them and listening to them. Frankly, leave me a comment. Leave me suggestions, things you'd like for me to talk about, things that I say that you disagree with or you agree with. You can always contact me through the website, michaelbrowntoday.com. You can send me a message that way about something I've said or not said. But I hope you enjoy it. I hope you'll subscribe to it. And we will talk to you again tomorrow.